January 17th, 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Oahu. The salt air hung thick over the oil-stained waters where the USS Arizona still smoldered beneath the surface. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki stood on the deck of the battleship Nagato, anchored in Hashirajima Bay, 5,000 miles away, reviewing intelligence reports that had crossed his desk in leather-bound folders stamped with the Imperial Navy seal. His fingers traced the reconnaissance photographs, images of American destroyers moving in precise formation along the California coast, cruisers repositioning with mathematical accuracy near San Diego, carriers executing synchronized maneuvers that seemed impossible for a fleet supposedly crippled just 6 weeks prior. The cigarette between his lips had burned to ash, forgotten. What he saw in those photographs contradicted every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy had made about their enemy. The Americans were not reeling. They were reorganizing with a speed and coordination that defied the logic of naval warfare as Japan understood it. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been conceived as a decapitation strike, a single, devastating blow that would paralyze American naval power in the Pacific for at least 18 months, perhaps longer. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had predicted this timeline based on detailed studies of American industrial capacity and naval doctrine conducted throughout the 1930s. Japanese naval planners had calculated that the loss of battleships, the psychological shock, and the logistical chaos would create a window during which Japan could establish an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The plan assumed that American forces scattered across vast ocean distances and traumatized by sudden attack would require months simply to assess their losses, reorganize their command structure, and restore basic operational capability. The Japanese Admiralty believed they understood their enemy, a nation of individualists, soft from decades of peace, operating with a naval tradition barely a century old compared to Japan's ancient warrior culture. They expected confusion, paralysis, and a slow, grinding recovery period during which Japanese forces would consolidate their territorial gains. But within days of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese submarine commanders began reporting observations that troubled the Naval General Staff. American destroyer patrols appeared along projected routes with unsettling frequency. Convoy formations moved with unexpected discipline. Most disturbing of all, damaged vessels were disappearing from Hawaiian waters and reappearing in West Coast shipyards with impossible speed. By mid-January 1942, reconnaissance flights confirmed what Japanese intelligence officers had begun to suspect. The United States Navy was operating with a level of coordination that suggested something fundamentally different from what Japanese doctrine had anticipated. The Americans weren't simply recovering. They were executing a pre-planned reorganization that appeared to have been waiting, like a coiled spring, for the moment of crisis. Admiral Ugaki convened a series of classified briefings in late January, pulling together intelligence from across the Pacific theater. What emerged from those sessions was a portrait of an enemy that contradicted every preconception. Japanese naval attachés in neutral ports reported American supply ships departing on schedule, their manifests suggesting coordination between Atlantic and Pacific commands. Intercepted radio traffic, while encrypted beyond immediate decryption, revealed communication volumes and patterns that indicated constant information flow between Pearl Harbor, San Diego, San Francisco, and Washington. Most significantly, the speed at which American task forces were being reconstituted suggested that the organizational framework had not been destroyed. It had merely been disrupted, and the mechanisms for rapid restoration had already existed within the system. The Japanese Admiralty had based their strategic calculations on a fundamental misunderstanding of American naval philosophy. Japanese doctrine emphasized the concentration of force, the decisive battle, the moment of supreme confrontation, where superior spirit and tactical brilliance would triumph. Their command structure was vertical, hierarchical, bound by tradition and protocol. Orders flowed downward from Tokyo through layers of command. Initiative at lower levels was discouraged. This system worked magnificently when executing coordinated strikes like Pearl Harbor, but it assumed that enemy forces operated within similar constraints. The Americans, Japanese planners discovered too late, had built something entirely different, a distributed command system where authority could be delegated rapidly, where junior officers were trained to operate independently within broader strategic frameworks, and where logistics networks could reroute and adapt without requiring approval from distant headquarters. By February 1942, the evidence was overwhelming. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike force, received reports that American carriers, the very ships that had escaped destruction by being at sea during the attack, were operating in coordinated hunter-killer groups. The USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown weren't simply avoiding Japanese forces. They were being positioned according to some larger pattern that Japanese intelligence could not fully decode. American submarines were appearing in Japanese shipping lanes with knowledge of convoy routes that suggested sophisticated intelligence sharing. Supply lines to Wake Island, Midway, and other Pacific outposts were being maintained despite Japanese interdiction efforts, indicating logistics coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. The symbolic weapon that came to represent this American capability was not a battleship or carrier, but something far more prosaic: the radio telephone. Japanese naval officers had long dismissed American reliance on wireless communication as a vulnerability. Transmissions could be intercepted, patterns analyzed, codes potentially broken. Japanese doctrine emphasized radio silence, visual signals, prearranged plans executed with minimal communication, but the Americans had built their entire naval coordination system around constant, encrypted communication. Every destroyer, every cruiser, every supply ship was a node in a vast information network. Damage reports, position updates, intelligence assessments, tactical adjustments all flowed through this network continuously. When Pearl Harbor burned, the network adapted. Ships were rerouted, task forces reconstituted, defensive perimeters adjusted, all through the invisible web of radio waves that connected American naval forces across the Pacific. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary, preserved after the war, that the realization came to him in early March 1942. "We have attacked their ships, but we have not touched their system. The Americans fight not as individual vessels, but as a single organism distributed across the ocean. Cut off one limb and another moves to compensate. Destroy one base and they route supplies through another. Their strength lies not in the steel of their hulls, but in the connections between their vessels." The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided the first major test of this emerging understanding. For the first time in naval history, opposing fleets fought an entire battle without ever sighting each other directly, conducting operations entirely through carrier aircraft. Japanese forces expected this arrangement to favor their tactical doctrine. Their pilots were more experienced, their torpedoes more reliable, their dedication absolute. But American forces demonstrated something that troubled Japanese commanders deeply. Their task forces operated with seamless coordination between multiple carriers, sharing reconnaissance data, coordinating strike packages, managing combat air patrols across dozens of ships. When the carrier Lexington was mortally wounded, American forces executed an organized withdrawal that preserved their remaining strength. Japanese forces, following doctrine that emphasized pressing the attack regardless of cost, suffered proportionally heavier pilot losses they could not easily replace. The pattern repeated at Midway 1 month later, but with devastating consequences for Japan. American codebreakers had provided strategic intelligence about Japanese intentions, But what turned that intelligence into victory was the coordination of American naval forces. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, operated as a unified striking force despite being spread across hundreds of square miles of ocean. When Japanese scouts finally located the American fleet, they found not scattered, disorganized vessels, but coordinated task groups that could concentrate their air power within minutes. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway was not simply a matter of luck or timing. It was the result of an American naval system that could process intelligence, position forces, and execute strikes with a speed and coordination that Japanese forces, for all their tactical brilliance, could not match. Japanese admirals reviewing the Midway disaster in its aftermath grappled with a disturbing truth. They had been outmaneuvered not by superior ships or more skilled pilots, but by a superior system of coordination. American damage control teams had kept the Yorktown in action despite torpedo hits that should have sunk her. American logistics had positioned fuel and ammunition exactly where needed. American radio discipline had maintained operational security while still allowing tactical communication. Most tellingly, American forces had adapted their tactics mid-battle, shifting targets and changing approach vectors based on real-time intelligence in ways that suggested a level of coordinated flexibility that Japanese doctrine had never anticipated. The symbolic radio telephone began appearing in Japanese after-action reports with increasing frequency, transformed from a mere tool into a representation of something larger, the American way of war. Japanese naval culture had been built on centuries of samurai tradition, emphasizing individual prowess, hierarchical discipline, and spiritual dedication. American naval culture, barely 70 years removed from the Civil War, had been built on industrial organization, technological integration, and pragmatic adaptation. Where Japanese training emphasized perfection in execution of predetermined plans, American training emphasized flexibility in response to changing conditions. Where Japanese command structure concentrated decision-making authority at the highest levels, American doctrine distributed authority and encouraged initiative at every level of command. By late 1942, Admiral Yamamoto himself, in private correspondence preserved after his death, acknowledged the strategic implications. We face not merely an enemy fleet, but an enemy system. They coordinate as we have never coordinated. They share information as we have never shared it. Their damaged vessels return to battle faster than we believed possible. Their supply lines stretch across an ocean, yet function with greater reliability than ours across shorter distances. We assumed that spirit would overcome material, that dedication would triumph over industry. We did not anticipate that they would transform industry itself into a weapon, that their abundance would enable a form of warfare we had not imagined. The evidence accumulated through 1943 and 1944 in intelligence reports, captured documents, and tactical analyses. American submarine forces operating from bases scattered across the Pacific coordinated their patrols to create overlapping coverage of Japanese shipping lanes. American amphibious operations from Guadalcanal through the Gilbert Islands to the Marshalls demonstrated logistics coordination that allowed forces to be supplied, reinforced, and supported across thousands of miles of ocean. American carrier task forces grew in size and capability, eventually operating in groups of 4, 6, 8 carriers simultaneously, coordinating their air operations with a precision that Japanese forces never achieved. The fast carrier task force, dozens of ships moving in formation, launching coordinated strikes, defending each other with interlocking anti-aircraft fire, became the dominant weapon of the Pacific War, and it was fundamentally a creation of American naval coordination doctrine. The symbolic radio telephone, that humble device that allowed ship-to-ship communication, represented something deeper that Japanese admirals came to understand too late: the integration of technology and organization into a system greater than the sum of its parts. Japanese naval power had been built on magnificent individual vessels, the Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever constructed, the Zuikaku and Shokaku, superb fleet carriers, the long lance torpedo, the finest naval weapon of its type in the world. But vessels, however magnificent, were only as effective as the system that coordinated them. American vessels, often individually inferior to their Japanese counterparts in the war's early years, operated within a system that multiplied their effectiveness. Japanese post-war naval analyses compiled by surviving officers for American occupation authorities returned repeatedly to this theme. The United States Navy had not won the Pacific War primarily through material superiority, though American industrial capacity certainly provided an overwhelming advantage by 1944. They had won through organizational superiority through the ability to coordinate dispersed forces across vast distances through systems that could adapt to battle damage and operational setbacks with a resilience that Japanese doctrine had never anticipated. The Americans had built a navy that functioned as a network rather than a hierarchy, and once that network achieved critical mass, it became virtually impossible to defeat through conventional naval operations. The deeper truth. In the decades after the war, as historians examined captured Japanese documents and interviewed surviving officers, a fuller picture emerged. What Japanese admirals had concluded about American naval coordination was this: they had confronted not merely a different navy, but a different conception of naval power itself. The American system, with its emphasis on distributed authority, technological integration, and logistics coordination, reflected something fundamental about American society. The democracy that Japanese militarists had dismissed as weak and undisciplined had produced a form of military organization that mirrored its political structure, decentralized, adaptive, resilient. The industrial abundance that Japanese planners had calculated could be overcome by superior spirit had instead enabled a system of warfare that Japanese tradition had no framework to counter. The radio telephone, that symbol of constant communication and coordinated action, represented the transformation of American abundance into organized power. Where scarcity demanded concentration and hierarchy, abundance enabled distribution and flexibility. Where isolation bred self-sufficiency, connection enabled specialization. The Americans had taken their material wealth and transformed it through organizational innovation into a military system that could coordinate operations across an entire ocean, that could absorb devastating losses and rebuild with impossible speed, that could learn from defeat and adapt with a rapidity that rigid Japanese doctrine could not match. The conclusion reached by Japanese admirals in the war's final years carried a bitter irony. They had attacked Pearl Harbor to prevent American naval power from interfering with Japanese expansion. They had succeeded in sinking battleships, but they had failed to comprehend what they were actually fighting. The American Navy they destroyed on December 7, 1941, was already obsolete, a battleship navy that would have been inadequate for the carrier war that followed. The attack forced the Americans to rebuild around their carriers and, in rebuilding, to fully implement the coordination systems that would ultimately prove decisive. The Japanese had not crippled their enemy. They had transformed their enemy into something far more dangerous, forcing the Americans to become what they might not otherwise have needed to become. In the end, what Japanese admirals concluded was what their own doctrine had made impossible to foresee: that naval power in the modern age would belong not to the fleet with the largest ships or the most skilled individual warriors, but to the force that could coordinate its strength most effectively across distance and time. The Americans had built that force, almost by accident, through the integration of their industrial abundance, their technological sophistication, and their organizational flexibility. The radio telephone hummed with encrypted messages across the Pacific, coordinating the movements of hundreds of vessels, and in that constant flow of information lay the real strength of American naval power, a strength that Japanese admirals finally understood only after it had crushed them.